Good morning. Morning. Hello. Yes, hey, I know. It's not even, it's beyond wake-up time now, so you've no excuse. Well, I'm very pleased to be here to talk about the Common Core and formative assessment, and hopefully to build on what Stanley talked about this morning in his extremely illuminating introduction. And I'm sure Stanley, as you can see, is an expert on many things. So don't feel aggrieved, Stanley, that you're the keynote and I'm the expert, because you really are the expert. So I begin with this cartoon, which I hope you can see. The first box says, I taught Stripe how to whistle. Well, I don't hear him whistling. I said I taught him. I didn't say he learned it. And so my focus is going to be on how we make sure that students are learning what we want them to learn. Indeed, what we need them to learn to be successful in acquiring the Common Core state standards. And so my talk this morning, I'm not going to spend a long time talking about next generation standards and assessment because Stanley gave such a wonderful overview. But I do want to talk and build on what he said about a balanced assessment system. And then I want to talk specifically about formative assessment, what it is and what it isn't. And I have to tell you that I've been working in this area for quite some time, both in the UK, as you can probably hear, and no, this is not a New Jersey accent. And although sometimes I do get confused as a New Jersey resident, but I'm not. So there's, and in here in the US, and there's still quite a bit of confusion about what formative assessment is and what it isn't. So I'm hoping that I can bring some clarity to that area today. And I also want to talk a little bit about supporting teachers with formative assessment, how we do that. And I'll specifically mention how SBAC is planning to do that as well. So let me start, that's the overview. Let me start with this idea of next generation standards and assessment. And I'm calling it next generation because, of course, we have the next generation science standards. I don't know what the status of that is in California, but certainly states around the country are starting to adopt next generation science as well. And we do know, we've heard from Stanley, that there are going to be significant changes ahead. I was very struck when Stanley asked the question about how many teachers in your schools are teaching in the way that those specific items demand. And a quick read showed that most people felt that that wasn't current practice in their schools. Is that fair? Yep. So we've got to get, and I'm going to be doing a session after this, a breakout session on the shifts in the Common Core and supporting those instructionally. But if we look at the Common, and this is taken from the Common Core documents, that they include rigorous content and application of knowledge through higher order skills. And as we saw through those assessment items, is the application of knowledge and higher order thinking. And they're also informed by top performing countries so that all students are prepared to succeed in our global economy and society. And if have you ever heard Andreas Schleicher talk? He's the guy from the OECD who does the analyses of the PISA and Pearl. Have you ever heard him talk? If you ever get a chance, it's worth it. His slides are to die for. But in terms of the US performance relative to other countries, this has been a spur for the Common Core to shore up American students and make sure not only are they college and career ready here in the US, but they're also internationally competitive. And the whole point, as you heard from Stanley, is that we're really going for deeper learning. I'm sure you've heard the criticism that Bill Schmidt leveled, particularly at the math curriculum in the US, that it's a mile wide and an inch deep. Remember that? Mile wide and inch deep? The Common Core is moving us from that quite significantly to curricula that is deep, that demands deep learning. And I think you saw that exemplified in Stanley's tasks, or the SBAC tasks, I shouldn't call them Stanley's. That we want students to really, less is more, that they are more focused on important content, which is going to equip them to be college and career ready, and we want them to go a lot deeper. And so instruction is going to have to shift accordingly. So we know, I know you spent the day yesterday talking about the shifts in the Common Core, but just to remind us, the ELA standards have a very strong emphasis on critical thinking and being able to argue from evidence and evaluate the arguments of others. One editorial comment, if you could just switch the video off for a second, is that I wish the Common Core had said something about learning to like reading. Don't you? I mean, let's not lose that in our schools. That, you know, when I grew up as a teacher, and especially a reading teacher, that's what I wanted kids to do, to enjoy reading. I hope we're not going to lose that in the Common Core. So just as a little aside, we need to make sure that's still one of our goals, even though it's not called out specifically. The math standards place strong emphasis on students' ability to use their knowledge to solve problems. So arguing from evidence and using knowledge to solve problems, and balancing conceptual understanding and procedural fluency, not an either or, but a balance. Now, a colleague of mine at Crest, in fact, two colleagues, Joan Herman and Bob Lynn, recently did a review of the Smarter Balance and the PARC, you know, the other testing consortium, which the rest of the country is going with. They did a review of the test items and the tasks that are made available through Smarter Balance. And they found, and I think we saw that in the examples this morning, that a large proportion of the items will assess deep learning. Now, just to remind you, deep learning and the depth of knowledge, Norm Webb and colleagues, DOK1, depth of knowledge 1, the recall of facts, Stanley showed you some items, DOK2, the application of concepts and or procedures involving some mental processing, DOK3, the applications requiring abstract thinking, reasoning, and or more complex inferences, and then DOK4, extended analysis or investigation that requires synthesis and analysis across multiple contexts and non-routine applications. Now, I want you to pay attention specifically to DOK 3 and 4. Now, I don't know how many of you, and I don't even know if California was included in this study, but RAND produced a study, you know, the RAND organization, they produced a study of assessment items on 17 states' tests. This is pre-Common Core. And these 17 states were states that had represented themselves as having items with high levels of DOK. Guess how many items in these state tests they found at DOK 3 and 4? As a percentage. 0. Guess how many ELA, percentage of ELA at DOK 3 and 4? Bit more than that, about 7 or 8%. So that, I think, indicates to you what Stanley was talking about this morning, that we are really notching up what we're expecting of our students through the Common Core and through tests. And when Joan Herman and Bob Lynn, and this paper is available on the Crest website, and I do recommend you look at it because it's really interesting, not only in what they found, but in terms of explaining the Smarter Balance methodologies as well in terms of assessment design. And what they found is that through the specification for test items and tasks, a large proportion of items will measure deeper learning. So in mathematics, 49% DOK 3 and 21% DOK 4. ELA, 43% DOK 3, 25% DOK 4. So that is going to be a big difference. So in terms of what is required from our teachers, what I want to argue next is that if we're going to support deep learning, then we are going to have skilled teachers who can engage in successful formative assessment. And I want to argue to you this morning that formative assessment is one way, and in fact a major way, we can help students move to deeper learning and make sure they're on track to meet the Common Core goals. So let me now talk a little bit about formative assessment. And I want to begin, Stanley talked about a balanced assessment system. And I want to present to you some work that Joan Herman, my colleague at Crest, and I put together a while ago, and has been adapted since, with this idea of assessments in the system. So we start with the student, and then we have those minute-by-minute assessments, the daily, the weekly, the unit assessment, the quarterly assessment, and the annual assessment. And so what you can see from this, talk to your neighbor quickly about where you see formative assessment in this. Where's formative assessment in the balanced assessment system? Tell your neighbor what you think. But be sure to stop talking when I ask you. Okay? And I have been a school principal, so I can silence this room, just so you know. Okay, so please cease your conversation. Thank you. In my book, formative assessment is here, very proximate to student learning, and we'll talk about why later. But it's the way that teachers gather evidence and act on it that's proximate, i.e. really close to the student learning. This is further away from the student learning. The annual assessments, they sample the learning that's taken place over the course of the year. But here, the minute by minute, the daily, and even the weekly, that is where the formative assessment occurs at that level. Unit assessment can be formative if it's given before the end of the unit, so there's still some time to do something about it. And then the quarterly, the Smarter Balance is producing optional interim assessments, which districts can opt into or not, and then the annual state tests. And notice here that this is the progression towards the standards. So each assessment has a slice of learning toward the standards. So here, with the very proximate assessment to student learning, it's going to be much more fine-grained. We want to keep track of how student learning is developing in the course of a lesson, or how students' learning is developing in the course of several lessons. So it's difference in grain size and length of teaching and learning covered. And what I want to argue today is the importance of this end of the continuum in making sure that student learning is on track to meeting the standards. We cannot wait 6 weeks or longer to figure out if student learning is on track. Because if it isn't, what happens? They've missed the boat. It's too late. We've got to move on. So we can't be in the business of constantly remediating students. And remember what Stanley said about the demands, particularly for strugglers, struggling students, students with disabilities, ELs. We've got to be on top of their learning as that learning is developing. So if you think about this, and I think this is a useful way to think about a balanced assessment system. It's not good or bad. It's assessment for different purposes for different decisions. And these assessment purposes here are intended to figure out where students are while. Remember? While they're learning. Not when they've done it, did they get it or didn't it, but while they're in the course of learning. So that leads me to this idea of what formative assessment is not. First of all, it's not a test or an instrument. People say formative assessments. There's no such thing as a formative assessment. Yeah, you might use assessment for formative purposes the same way as you might use it for summative purposes, but there's no such thing. It's not a specific test. Some people think formative assessment is giving more quizzes. No, it's not about that. It's not about giving a score. And I'll say later, if we want this deep learning, we have to have assessment that's going to give us substantive insights into student learning. A score might tell you what level a kid's achieved, but it doesn't tell you why they've achieved it, or if they haven't achieved what you'd hoped them to achieve, why they haven't achieved it. We need to be focusing much more on learning as it is in the course of developing. It's not something that happens at the end of a period of learning. Sure, an assessment that's a benchmark after a quarter can be used formatively if you do something with it, but it's not formative assessment as described in the literature. And there is quite a big literature on formative assessment that when it's applied effectively, it works. And in the literature, formative assessment is not just something that teachers do. Students are involved in the process. And I think if we're really serious about college and career ready, we have to have kids that can learn for themselves, that they know how to learn. I think that's inherent in the standards. I just wish it was called out more. But I think if you really examine the standards, you will see that learning how to learn is going to be one of the core areas of learning for our students. So this might not square with what you came in thinking about formative assessment. And I want to go a little bit further, because I do want to stress that what I'm talking about is based on research. This isn't Margaret Heritage standing up with a cool idea. Yeah, it is a cool idea, of course. But it's based in research. And I'm not going to spend hours and hours going over the research, because actually you can read my book if you want to. In fact, I'm going to show you another book I just wrote, so you can read that as well. So this is the definition I've used, and it's very consistent with a lot of other definitions. One of the other hats I wear is I lead a state collaborative under the Council of Chief State School Officers on formative assessment for students and teachers. And they came up with a definition 6 years ago, which you may have seen has been widely cited nationally. And this is very consistent with that and other definitions. So what do you notice here? First of all, it's a process, or a set of practices. It's not a thing, it's not a one-time event. It takes place continuously during the course of teaching and learning, not at the end of, but during. And it provides teachers, and notice who else? Students. Teachers and students, because teachers and students are together in this process. And it provides them with feedback to close the gap between current learning and desired goals. So let's just look at that again. It's a process, not a thing. It takes place continuously, hence the minute by minute, day by day, week by week. If you've gone longer than a week and you don't know where your kids are, then I suggest you need to get focused on what they have learned that week and what they haven't learned and what you need to do next. So that's the feedback that teachers get, and students also get feedback from their self-assessment to close the gap. Now, I'm not talking about the achievement gap of No Child Left Behind. When you start to learn something, okay, this is your starting place. If you're going to learn something, you're going to set a goal. You're all educators. You know that you don't set a goal over here and you don't set a goal over here. It's manageable. What is there between where I am and where I want to be, say, at the end of a lesson? Look at my hands. Look at what's on the... This is DOK1. A gap. My job is to close that gap as a teacher. I'm setting my lesson goal, maybe 2-3 periods. My kids are here. I want them to be here. I want them to have learnt something, maybe looking back to that how to organize an argument or how to organize information. Maybe I'm working on how to organize information. Kids aren't going to learn how to organize information immediately. It's going to take some time. So I want to make sure that I'm paying attention to how my instruction and student learning is moving toward meeting that goal. What happens when I meet that goal? I sit back, paint my nails? No. Another gap. So this idea of closing the gap. And that's core. That comes from the work of Royce Sadler, who wrote this seminal paper in 1989. It's completely foundational to the field. And he coined the term, the gap, between where you are and where you want to be. Remember, short-term, proximal to learning. I also wrote another book just recently. And I've embraced this idea of a children's rights approach to assessment. This isn't my idea, it comes from some scholars actually in the UK, but I've adopted it and thought about it in terms of formative assessment. So we need to have assessment that's in the best interests of the children. What's an assessment that's in the best interests of the children? In my book, it's figuring out where kids are so you can help them move forward. It's figuring out where kids are while they're learning so they don't end up somewhere off track and having to be remediated. It's about figuring out where students are so that every child has the opportunity to learn, progress, and succeed equally. That doesn't mean to say they're all going to get the same diet, but equally. So my super, super smart, gifted student needs to have the opportunity to progress in the same way that my really, really struggling kids have the right to progress, and everybody in between, which means focusing on the individuals. Doesn't mean to say you're going to do one-on-one teaching, but it's paying attention to individuals. And then students are involved in the decisions that come from assessment use. At the end of the day, we can help students learn, but we can't do the learning for them. They're the ones that learn, not us. They need to do the learning. And so if students are not involved in this assessment and learning process, then you really are missing half of the equation. Because they must be involved, not only to be college and career ready and learn how to learn, but be successful in meeting the standards. And I'll say a bit more about that in a second. So, I've talked about keeping kids on track. And there are 3 key questions, and this is a framework that has been put forward by several researchers, and I've used it, and a lot of other people around the country use it, in terms of key questions for teachers. The first is, where's the learner going? What do I want my kids to learn? Why have we all shown up in this classroom today? Not what I want kids to do, what do I want them to learn? And we're going to have to get really good at figuring out that deep learning from the Common Core. What is it I want them to learn? Now, I've worked with teachers across the world, and I have to say that this is hard for teachers. You know why? Because they tend to focus on what kids are going to do. And then you ask them, well, why are they doing that? And that's a harder question. So I would submit to you that if you're a supporter of teachers, which I'm assuming you are, that's why you're here, then one of your roles will be to help teachers focus on that learning. What is it I want students to learn? Then, where's the learner now? Okay, I know what I want my students to learn. I've got this bang-up lesson. I think it's going to support deep learning. I'm not going to get to the end of the lesson, though, without figuring out where my students are. They may have a misconception. I may have confused them. Or they may be right where I want them to be. But I've got to figure out how that learning is developing. And if it's deep learning, which is what we're going for here, it's not just about learning a few facts and testing them on them. It's not just about learning a few computation skills and giving them 50 problems. It's about learning deeply, which takes time, and teachers need to know where the students are. And then the key, remember that children's rights idea, where are my students, and then what do I do next to help them progress so they do meet those standards? So these 3 questions for teachers. However, remember I said who else was involved in formative assessment? Students. So the students have the same 3 questions. Where am I going? Students need to understand what they're learning and why they're learning it. We heard Stanley say that older kids will say, well, why am I doing this? Like, why the heck am I learning algebra? Good question. Where am I going? What is my goal? What am I supposed to learn here? Where am I now? We cannot have students in our classrooms who sit there as learned helplessness. Our students have to be aware of where they are now. Am I learning what my teacher thinks I should be learning? So we will need to have students involved in some kind of self-assessment. Am I learning what they need, what my teacher wants me to learn? And then where do I go next? What do I do? Remember, that's part of being a lifelong learner, that I can manage my own learning. So with that said then, do those 3 questions make sense to you in terms of a frame for formative assessment? Where am I going? Where am I now? Where to next? So how can formative assessment help in all of this? Well, we know that we saw that the cone with the annual assessments at the end of the year, sampling a year's worth of learning. So that's a large grain size. You can't sample every single thing a kid's learned, but you can get those big hot ticket items that you want students to learn. And in terms of formative assessment, where we're looking at that area that's much more proximate to student learning, the minute by minute, the daily and weekly. So I have to figure out, I've planned my instruction, I've planned the learning experiences, so where are my students now in relation to this learning goal? 15 minutes into the lesson, where are they? 30 minutes into the lesson, the end of the lesson, I have to decide when I need to collect that evidence. What's the gap? Because remember, if it's deep learning, they're not going to go from here to here just like that. They may be developing a concept that they've got a partial understanding, it's fragmentary, it's a misunderstanding. I need to figure out how they're thinking. I need to get inside their heads to the best I can. And then what's the gap between where they are and where I want them to go? And are there any misconceptions or particular difficulties the kids are having that I can address there and then? So it's this idea of keeping on top, collecting evidence and keeping on top of learning as it is developing. And so, as I said earlier, what we need is not scores. And this is not my language, this is Laurie Shepherd, her measurement expert. And she talks about quit looking at the numbers. Okay, just quit looking at the numbers. What we have to do is get inside kids' heads. Now, wouldn't it be nice, and I'll probably be dead and gone, but some of you might be young enough so that when we have all this imaging, this brain imaging, we won't give, computer-adapted tests. We'll just stick something on the kid and see what the brain activity is. But until we can do that, we have to try to have kids externalize what's in their heads, how they're thinking, so we can work with them. So getting these substantive insights to support deep learning. And you're probably familiar with the term assessment for learning. You heard that? So formative assessment in other parts of the world is called assessment for learning, whereas assessment for summative purposes tends to be called assessment of learning. So the idea of formative assessment is that you are going to assist learners to make sure they get to where you want them to be. And assessment to assist learning has to have as its starting point where kids already are, where they've got to. Not where you think they should have got to, or not what's in the end of the chapter test, but where are they and how do I help them move forward? Now, the reason I'm showing you this, anybody any ideas why I'm showing you this? It's a Rembrandt drawing, just to keep, you know, the art theme going from Stanley, Picasso to Rembrandt. Why do you think I'm showing you this? Any ideas? Somebody shout out. Yes, go ahead.
Well, the adult is pointing to where the child needs to go.
Excellent. The adult is pointing forward. This is the direction. Okay? This is where you need to go. Why else am I showing it to you?
It's a work in progress.
It's a work in progress. What's this child trying to do? Walk. Okay, we know learning to walk takes time. Why else am I showing it to you? Glad you came this morning, sir. Yeah, I hadn't thought of it that way, but it's a draft. It's not fully complete.
I feel like they're trying to get at the child's level, like what is he or she seeing as opposed to, from their level.
Exactly right. They're down at the child's level.
It's also taking more than one adult to guide that child.
Oh, that's nice. I hadn't thought of that either. So yeah, that's a great sort of takes a village, or at least takes two. But the adults are bending down to the child's level. They're not standing up and showing the kid how to walk, now do this, but it's contingent on where the kid is. That's the kind of instruction we need in our classrooms if we're going to get deep learning and meeting the Common Core. It's got to be contingent on where the students are. And in order to be contingent, we've got to figure out where are they in understanding this deep concept, or acquiring these deep skills, or this deep knowledge. It takes time, and it's going to be incremental, and we better figure out where the kids are. So that's why I showed you this, pointing the way forward. We've had some very nice examples, and coming to the child's level, and being formed as a preliminary sketch, and then the last comment about it takes more than one. And I think that's a really good point, because if teachers are going to be successful with the Common Core and indeed formative assessment, then I would argue that it's going to take a lot of collaboration. That's at least what we've seen out in the field in areas when we've been doing this work. So more support for formative assessment has just come from the National Research Council, a National Academies Press publication. And remember, one of Stanley's bullets was transference. We want kids to be able to transfer what they learn into other contexts. That's part of what deep learning entails. And look what they said. Ongoing formative assessment by teachers can provide guidance to students which supports and extends their learning, encouraging deeper learning and the development of transferable competencies. Now, you could have substituted words and said the Common Core is intended to encourage deeper learning and the development of transferable competencies. So this just came out, and there's a lot in it about formative assessment, encouraging deep learning and 21st century skills. If you haven't looked at it, I suggest it's very readable, and I think it's an important book. So we have support for the idea of ongoing formative assessment, and again they use the term ongoing, not periodic or when I feel like it formative assessment, but ongoing. By teachers can provide guidance to students, supports and extends their learning to encourage deeper learning and the development of transferable competencies. So, it's not a test, it's not a one-time event, it's something that happens which engages teachers and students in a process of learning and meeting those proximate learning goals so that kids don't get left behind. Why would teachers not engage in formative assessment if that's what it does? That's a rhetorical question. If you're scratching your head thinking, what's the answer to that one? That's rhetorical. So having said all that, I wanted to go a little bit deeper now into what constitutes formative assessment. And remember, and I keep stressing this, because I think sometimes people think, well, this is just a cool idea that's just come in and, you know, this time will pass. Well, it may pass, but I hope it doesn't, because other top-performing countries in the world, I shouldn't even say other, because we're not top-performing countries in the world have well-developed systems of formative assessment or assessment for learning. So what are these main features then? Well, the first thing is, remember what I said? Where am I going? Learning goals, learning targets. What is it that I am going to learn? Why did we all show up today in this classroom? What are we going to learn? And then, and Stanley talked about, what are these performances of understanding? So if I want my kids to learn this, how will I know if they've learned it? What will those performances of understanding be? And in the formative assessment world, they're called success criteria. Is this a familiar, or criteria for success? Is this a familiar term to you? See some people nodding, other people looking completely blank, like, what the heck's she talking about? No? Okay. So the teacher identifies a learning goal, then the performances of understanding. But remember that the students have to be involved in formative assessment for it really to be a process of formative assessment. So they need to know what those learning goals are. And they also need to know how they will know if they're learning it. So in really effective formative assessment classrooms, you'll see the teachers spending quite a chunk of a lesson, which could be, 3-4 periods, talking about what is it that we're going to learn, and then sharing examples of what that learning looks like. So learning shouldn't be a secret. Kids should have a sense of what is the quality that I'm going for. So they can be engaged in the learning and they can monitor their own learning. So I want to show you a science learning goal from a high school teacher that I worked with fairly recently. And this is how he set up his thinking. So he's got time blocks of 90 minutes. And his big idea from science is, I wish I could read what it says on my computer, but DNA is a warehouse of the genetic code that, well, you can probably read it better than I can, but let me read it, that provides information that, what? Controls cellular structure and activities. You see how much I know about DNA, can't you? I can't even do a closed procedure. So prior knowledge, that's the prior knowledge the students will need, and so he'll be assessing to make sure they have that prior knowledge. And then his learning goals, he wants the kids to understand how the structure of DNA relates to the function. And he's allocated his 3 blocks of 90 minutes for this particular lesson. Okay, so beginning of the lesson, he's going to discuss all these with the students. But he also has specific criteria, and these aren't all of them, but he unfolds these. So the first thing he wants them to be able to do is define the term structure and function. Then he wants them to be able to describe the structure of DNA, explain why the base pair rule means that DNA forms complementary strands in a double helix, demonstrate the process of transcription and translation, and explain how a mutation may or may not alter the function of a protein. So he's listed a number of criteria by which he will judge if his students are meeting the goals he's established. He's going to use these criteria to collect evidence as these lessons unfold, and the students also know what it is they're expected to be able to do. So if I'm going along in the lesson, I think, oh, my job is to be able to describe the structure of DNA. Now, can I do that? If I can't, what do I do about it? I have to figure out some internal resources that I can deploy to figure that out. So the learning goals and success criteria. The next thing is, once I've got those, and I've got to elicit evidence of learning while it's taking place during a lesson. And there's no one way to elicit evidence. An Australian called Patrick Griffin talks about eliciting evidence through what students say, make, do, or write. And that's a good way to think about it. So if we go back to this here, you'll see describe the structure of DNA. Okay, so kids have to have the opportunity to either orally give descriptions or write descriptions. Explain why the base pair rules. Demonstrate. So these success criteria will lead to opportunities for students to be able to show their performances of understanding. So there's no one single way. And then teachers, during the lesson or for the next day, the subsequent lesson, or subsequent period rather, can think about, what do I do? Are my kids with me? So do I need to make any instructional adjustments, or shall I keep on going with what I've planned? So it's informing a decision. We can't have teachers just going through lessons without making informed decisions about where kids are in their learning and then what they do about them. Not if we're going to meet Common Core and attain that deep learning. Now, I'm going to show you an example of eliciting evidence from, it's a third grade classroom in Syracuse, New York. This is an implementation I did with New York State a while back. And look at how this teacher is collecting evidence. And then I want you to pay attention to what the teachers at the end of the video say.
And then 3, 6, 6. That's correct. It's D. I'm doing this. Wait.
What column did you put that last one in?
This one?
Mm-hmm.
We put in I know it and I proved it.
Can you tell me how you proved it?
Well, we showed our work and by adding the numbers at the bottom. We showed our work because that's how we put 5 plus 1. We showed our work by skip counting. Yes, but it was multiple.
Do you guys have any questions for your teacher, or are you sure about that one?
We sure about
You
that.
sure about that one?
Because that if we
Yeah, I'm sure about it.
If we add times these 3, 6, it's 6. And if we have an equal sign, 5 plus 1 is equals to 6. So we showed our work out on. Come help me out. Yes. If there is 2 different numbers, if they equal the same number, it will still be equal. Okay.
Could you, before you go on, could you tell me about this column here on the right, this problem?
They don't understand. We don't understand it. We're confused. They don't understand what I do.
Could you tell me what what don't you understand? Is there something you need help with that you read in the problem, or you're not sure what to do?
She keep on saying that we gotta add 2 more, so she making us unsure. So that's why I put it in.
But see how when we put 5 circles because it said divided by 5, and I asked her where did she get the number 35 and 25 from, and we not supposed to. She don't know if we were supposed to divide 35 with it.
So you guys have said for this one you need a teacher to help you again.
Yeah.
Right?
Because she said.
Thank you.
Still lets us very quickly see these are the type of problems they're still struggling with. We need to adjust our teaching, but they were able to tell us that instead of us giving an assessment
Right.
and we seeing it.
And we also could look at that and see that not all kids are struggling in the same area.
Right.
We could use that piece of information and see specifically what kids were struggling in what area and intervene on what they needed instead of reteaching everyone or working, you know, in a whole group setting and kids who already knew it or they didn't have that misconception or weren't getting retaught it or teaching something that they didn't need. And then it was a quick fix. You know, they could meet in small groups, you could meet one-on-one, or you can even have a peer teach them if you had to. But using that piece to guide your instruction following them.
So you saw those teachers using an eliciting activity, an evidence eliciting activity, and go back to Stanley's examples of SBAC. You know, having kids solve the problem, show their work, explain, very similar. And then notice what those teachers said. It's a quick fix, because going back to my Rembrandt drawing, you're meeting the students where they are. And those teachers completely changed how they operated in the classroom. The first time I met with them, it was in a professional development meeting, and they were sitting with arms folded like this. Well, you know what that means when you go into professional development sessions and they got their arms folded, right? And look how far they've come. And that was an inclusion classroom, and they were talking about all their kids moving forward, because it was a quick fix. You're meeting the student where they are, and that's what I meant by the individual aspect. So then providing feedback that moves learning forward, and the involvement of students through the use of teachers' feedback, peer assessment, and self-assessment. And the whole idea of formative assessment, it's not an add-on. When teachers say, well, I haven't got time to do any more assessment, the idea of this is part of your instruction. I mean, those kids were doing an assessment task, but it was actually an instructional task as well, working together. So I'm going to show you another video, and this is actually from California, not too far away. This is a school very near Skid Row in downtown Los Angeles. And I want you to notice what this teacher is doing with this student. I'm going to remind you, providing feedback, involvement of students, and integrated into instruction. So this is a 5th grade writing session.
Candy, what are you working on?
Working on my final draft, I want to make it kind of sentence, and I want your feedback.
Okay, so do we have our success criteria here, our checklist? What are you looking at right now? What are you focusing on? Are you focusing on punctuation? Are you focusing on grammar?
I'm focusing on this one.
Oh, clarity. So you're asking yourself if this is going to make sense to somebody who had no idea. So what do you think so far?
I don't know if because I started with 2 questions, and then I ended with a period, and then I started with another question.
I see. So let's read it and see how that makes sense.
It says, the world has been taken by trash. What are you willing to do to save our earth?
Okay, so let's go back to your original concern. So you're concerned about having 2 questions at the beginning. Well, the question that you have here at the beginning, I wonder why people don't pick the trash up. Well, you're following that up with what? What is this? People may argue that. What is that?
That's a counter argument.
That's a counter argument. So this question, I wonder why people don't pick up trash,
is connected to my counter argument.
Is connected to your counter argument. So it makes sense. Okay, so what's the other question that you feel maybe?
I was gonna put right here, after about 33 billion people don't care about the earth, I was gonna put, I wonder why they don't care. And then I was gonna put this one.
Oh, I see.
And I wanted to know if that was okay to put 2 questions and then a question period, another question.
Well, I think that I wonder why they don't care, and I wonder why people don't pick up trash. It's connected. It's connected. So is there a way that you think that maybe you can combine those 2 into one so that you don't have 2 questions back to back?
Yeah.
So can you think about that? Because I wonder why they don't care, and I wonder why people don't pick up trash.
Are the same.
Are connected to each other. So you can definitely think about connecting those 2 so that it's one question. but that has those two things, those two components that you wanted to make sure that were in there.
Okay.
Okay, so go ahead and think about how you can do that. Angelica is a very bright and motivated.
So, what did you see going on there? Language? Questions? Academic language? This was way before the Common Core, by the way, and they're talking about argument and counter-arguments. Do you notice her using that? What did you hear that kid say in the very beginning? I nearly passed out when I was in that classroom. You hear what she said? I'd like to get your feedback. Wouldn't we love every fifth grader in California to be asking their teacher, I'd like to get your feedback? Wouldn't we love every fifth grader in California to know, to be monitoring and assessing their work and be figuring out what it is that they need feedback on? She wasn't sure if she was focusing on clarity. She got her checklist, she got her criteria, she's focusing on clarity, and she wants the teacher feedback. What's happening here? Remember the student involvement. So we have the student involved there with getting feedback. And notice, and crucially, the teacher didn't tell her what to do. The teacher didn't say, well, you do this, and here's how you can write the two questions together. Gave her a suggestion that she can then use herself. Because in the end, who has to do the learning? The student. I think I've just got time to show you this. This is an 8th grade classroom, a social studies language arts classroom.
To comparing sentences. So now's the time to evaluate yourselves. One formative assessment that I use in class, usually 3 to 4 times a week, would be my guided groups. If you're an A person, that means, Ms. Moore, I have no idea what you just said, and I need to hear the lesson again. If you're a B person, it's going to be, I get it, but I have some clarifying questions, or I just need to hear you reteach the A people again. Or you're a C person, I'm an independent thinker, I'm an independent worker, I got it, I can go do this in my seat quietly for independent work time. Annotate in the right-hand margin what you are. Are you A, a B, or a C? Am I an A and I'm staying? Am I B, I have clarifying questions? Am I C, I'm an independent worker and I can get up and go? People to the left and the right, turn your heads to make sure that somebody has a letter on their paper. Doesn't matter what it is, as long as you can see a letter. I have their partner check to make sure that they did their job because we're all working together as a whole. Check. Then I say, okay, C people, you're free to go. They get up, they leave. A and B people just move in closer together. And I'll ask, B people, do you have specific questions? Because they're the ones that are right there on the cusp. Okay. A's and B's people, who's an A person? Okay, who's a B person? Okay, B people, do you have questions, or you just need me to talk to the A people and then you get up and leave when you're good? Do you have a question?
Yeah, is there like a limit to similes, metaphors, and
Absolutely not. You have a minimum of one of each, but you can put as many as you think you need in there.
Okay.
Good? Yeah. Cross out your B and you became a C. Jonna?
I don't know how I'd relate it to my constitutional issue.
Okay, what's your constitutional issue?
Gay rights.
Okay. If gay rights is your main focus, right? What could you say about that?
I don't know. I don't really know.
What could you compare it to? Can somebody help her out?
Wait, we're comparing them?
Yeah, she's struggling. Her issue, her constitutional issue is going to be gay rights.
You can compare it to women's rights or to abortion or...
Oh, see, look, Joel's gone. He just became a C person.
I get it now.
Does that make sense? So you can compare your gay rights to women's suffrage. You could do it to the Dred Scott case.
It all makes
You can
sense.
compare your amendment instead. Does that make sense? Okay, cross out your B. You became a C.
Okay, so those students are 8th grade. And did you notice what she said in front of her peers? I don't know. Because it's safe to say that in that classroom. So formative assessment, if you're going to use language and you're going to express your thinking publicly, you have to be doing it in a safe environment. And that classroom is a very safe environment. The saddest thing when I show that around the country, I was in a state in the Midwest recently with a group of middle school teachers, and they said, well, my kids won't do that. They're not motivated. That's really a sad comment, I think, on the way some of our kids are being supported in classrooms. So the idea then that students are involved in the learning process through peer assessment, through self-assessment, through teachers giving feedback to students that they can take on their own. So ensuring that the students are an active part of that learning process, not passive recipients. We are not going to get to deep learning, high levels of thinking as called for by the Common Core if we don't engage our students as learners. And I think formative assessment is one effective way that we can do that. Now, I was asked to say something about technology. This is my one little pathetic slide on technology. But I mean, I'm thinking, like one teacher I saw in Iowa, she uses these iPods to give feedback to her kids. She just if they've written something, she'll give them verbal feedback and then hand it to them. I've seen teachers take video, recordings of group work. If they're not with a group, they want to listen to how the children have been talking. On a pad, you can take photographs, you can write notes as things are happening in the classrooms. So there's a lot you can do with technology, and I think as the technology gets better and more flexible, there's going to be a lot more we can do with that. But I'm seeing some quite interesting applications already in classrooms. So I've now told you what formative assessment is, the main features of formative assessment, that it's teachers and students working together in classrooms to keep learning on track to meet those short-term goals that are going to meet the longer-term goals of the standards. In my experience, it demands a lot of teacher expertise because basically it's about changing the way you do business in the classroom. If you're one of the stand and deliver teachers and students aren't engaged in actively learning and taking some responsibility for their learning, then you've got a lot to do. And in terms of the teacher expertise required, it's not about giving teachers additional tests. But this is from the Assessment Reform Group, and they talk about formative assessment or assessment for learning should be regarded as a key professional skill for teachers. And let me tell you something, it doesn't matter where I go around this country, every single state I go to, they say their teachers are not coming out of higher ed prepared to do this work. So we have a lot to do at the initial pre-service level. So they have to plan for assessment. They have to observe learning through what kids say, make, do, or write. They have to analyze and interpret evidence, which means they have to have a really solid knowledge of the content. And then they have to be able to give feedback to learners and support those learners in self-assessment. And teachers should be supported in developing these skills through initial and continuing professional development. And basically, it's about the way you teach in the classroom. It's not about handing out more tests. It's about the way you teach in the classroom. And so if we look at some of those skills, break them out a little bit. The knowledge of standards, that's going to be deep knowledge of standards is going to be essential. Understanding what it means to learn a concept. What is entailed in learning a concept or a skill in advance of instruction? Because if you're going to be responsive to students and engaged in that Rembrandt Drawing contingent pedagogical responses, then you have to have some sense of what kids might say, what kids might do, and so on. And I think that's where teachers will need to pool their resources and the pedagogical content knowledge. So it's content knowledge, the understanding what the standards entail, and then how to support it pedagogically, and then knowing what is entailed by learning a particular concept. And what I'm seeing around the country is, and some research is emerging on the importance of teacher learning communities or professional learning communities or whatever you call them, but those seem to be holding a lot of promise, particularly if you can get around 75 minutes a month where teachers come together to talk about learning and formative assessment. We want to encourage teachers on reflective practice, and some states have already developed observation protocols to help teachers be reflective about formative assessment and work with peers through peer observation. We need support from administrators to make the time, to make the commitment, because it's a long, getting to the Common Core through formative assessment, I would say at least is a 5-year program. So of real intense focus, and then this ongoing commitment. But it can change. We know from the literature that effective formative assessment works. And effective formative assessment, as I've said, is not just more frequent mini-tests. It has to involve feedback and the students. And I want to share 2 quotes to end with from 2 teachers that I worked with in Syracuse many years ago. And Sharon said, "Formative assessment has not only changed me as a teacher, but I believe it has changed my students as learners." And then finally, Sean said, and this is how he was asked to respond to "I used to, but now I." This is his underlining. He says, "I used to do a lot of explaining, but now I do a lot of questioning. I used to do a lot of talking, but now I do a lot of listening. I used to think about teaching the curriculum, but now I think about teaching the student." And so in conclusion, I would say that Sean encapsulates very well what we need our teachers to be doing in support of the Common Core standards and deeper learning. And so I wish all of you well. There's lots of resources out there. Smarter Balance is putting together a digital library of tools and processes, model lessons with embedded formative assessment. So that should be available to you as well. So please do the work, because I sincerely believe that it will make a difference to our students in California. Thank you.